Putin promised impenetrable skies over Crimea, but in a single night, Ukrainian drones wiped out radars, silenced billion-dollar air defenses, and turned the region's main Russian air base into an exposed target. It all happened in the early hours of December 18th at Belbek. One MiG-31 fighter destroyed, pantsir air defense systems burning, and the central radar of the feared S-400 system simply vanished. While the Kremlin pretends nothing happened, we are going to show you how Ukraine blinded Crimea and exposed the biggest military lie Putin has told in this war. When we talk about Belbek, we are not talking about just any base. We are talking about the air power heart of Russia in occupied Crimea. Belbek Air Base, located on the outskirts of Sevastopol, has always been treated by the Kremlin as a top-tier strategic asset, something far too critical to fail. Since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Belbek has been turned into a true unsinkable aircraft carrier. Unlike a ship, it does not need to move, it cannot be sunk, and it operates 24 hours a day, projecting air power across the entire Black Sea and southern Ukraine. This is where early warning fighters, interceptor aircraft, and platforms responsible for protecting the most sensitive airspace in the region are based. Location is everything. Belbek sits just minutes of flight time from the Black Sea Fleet anchored in Sevastopol. In practical terms, the base functions as the fleet's air shield. Any drone, missile, or aircraft attempting to approach Russian warships must first survive the radar coverage and air defense umbrella centered on Belbek. That is why Moscow concentrated some of its most expensive and sophisticated sensors there. Long-range radars, systems integrated into the S-400 network, and mobile units like pantsir were not deployed by chance. Together, they formed an air denial bubble that, according to Russian narratives, made Crimea virtually untouchable. Belbek also plays another critical role. It sustains offensive operations. The base serves as a launch point for airstrikes against southern Ukraine and functions as a logistics, maintenance, and command hub. Without Belbek fully operational, Russia loses response time, situational awareness, and, most importantly, confidence in its control of the skies. And that is exactly why the attack was not just destructive, it was surgical. By hitting Belbek, Ukraine did not target a runway or a hangar. It went straight for the brain that allowed all of Crimea to see. And now, the question becomes unavoidable. How did drones manage to penetrate one of the most heavily protected airspaces in Russia without being intercepted? If Belbek was the brain, the execution had to be silent, precise, and invisible. And that is exactly where Ukraine's security service, the SBU, comes in, along with its most discreet and aggressive unit, the Alpha Special Operations Center. Unlike conventional strikes, this operation was not designed to overwhelm defenses, but to deceive them. The SBU has been investing heavily in long-range drones, platforms engineered to fly hundreds of kilometers with a reduced signature, programmable routes, and hybrid navigation, combining global positioning system guidance, inertial systems, and pre-planned corrections to survive even under electronic interference. These drones do not search for the target. They know exactly where it is before they even take off. The planning began weeks in advance. Analysts mapped vulnerability windows in Russian air patrols, radar activation patterns, and the times when human operators are most prone to fatigue. The choice of the early morning hours was not symbolic, it was mathematical. Less air traffic, lower crew rotation, and greater reliance on automated sensors. On the night of the attack, the drones followed carefully calculated corridors, exploiting radar shadows, coastal terrain, and blind angles created by the overlap of Russia's own systems. Instead of challenging the defensive bubble head-on, they slipped underneath it. Another critical factor was timing. The drones did not arrive as a swarm or in predictable waves. They entered in a staggered sequence, forcing Russian operators to react to multiple ambiguous contacts at the same time. Every wrong decision, turning on a radar, switching a search mode, prioritizing one target over another, exposed positions and opened gaps for the next vector. Alpha did not need to destroy everything. It needed to destroy the right things. Sensors, radars, and command systems, the eyes and ears of air defense. By the time the first explosions occurred, Belbek was already partially blind. What followed was inevitable. And this is where the strike becomes even more serious. This was not an opportunistic attack, it was a rehearsal, a live test against the best Russia claimed it had. Among all the targets hit at Belbek, one in particular carries enormous symbolic weight: the MiG-31. This is not a common fighter. It is a high-altitude, high-speed interceptor originally designed during the Cold War to hunt strategic bombers, cruise missiles, and anything that dared to cross Soviet airspace, and today, Russian airspace. Technically, the MiG-31 is a beast. A top speed above Mach 2.8, an operational ceiling above 20,000 meters, and a Zaslon radar capable of tracking multiple targets at long range. In Russian doctrine, it functions as the bodyguard of the sky, especially against fast, long-range threats. That is exactly why it was stationed at Belbek. But here is the critical point. The MiG-31 was not shot down in air-to-air combat. It was destroyed on the ground, vulnerable, with no chance to react. That alone already represents a serious operational failure. The direct cost of a MiG-31 is estimated at around $50 million, but the real value goes far beyond the burned airframe on the runway. Russia no longer produces this aircraft in series. Every operational unit depends on expensive modernization programs, reused older airframes, and an industrial effort increasingly constrained by sanctions. And there is something even harder to replace: pilots. MiG-31 crews require years of specialized training, flight hours under extreme conditions, and full integration with air defense systems. Even if no pilots were killed, something Moscow avoids confirming, the simple loss of the aircraft already reduces Russia's immediate interception capability in the region. There is also a question the Kremlin does not want to answer. Was the MiG-31 armed at the moment of impact? If so, the damage is even greater. Long-range missiles, such as the R-37M, cost millions per unit and are produced in limited numbers. A low-cost drone may have destroyed, in seconds, an entire package of strategic capabilities. In the end, the message is clear. If even one of Russia's most feared fighters can be eliminated while parked, on the ground, the problem is not the aircraft. It is the illusion of security. If destroying the MiG-31 was a visible blow, what happened to the radars was surgical and far more dangerous. Because in modern warfare, whoever loses their eyes loses the war before firing the next missile. The first of those eyes was the Nebo-SVU. This radar is not designed to engage targets directly. It is designed to see everything. With an estimated range of up to 350 kilometers, the Nebo-SVU was responsible for providing long-range situational awareness over almost all of Crimea, the Black Sea, and a significant portion of southern Ukraine. In practice, it functioned as the peninsula's early warning radar. Anything that took off, climbed, or moved at medium to high altitude appeared there first. Aircraft, cruise missiles, larger drones, everything passed through the Nebo before anything else. It fed data to fighters, command centers, and most importantly, to air defense systems. Without this radar, Crimea stops seeing far. It starts reacting late. And that is exactly what happened. But the next blow was even more devastating. Among the destroyed targets was the 92 N6 Gravestone radar, the operational brain of an S-400 battery. Here is the point Moscow avoids explaining. The S-400 does not function without the 92 N6. This radar is responsible for precise tracking, target designation, and final missile guidance. Without it, the launchers remain physically intact, but they are incapable of engaging anything beyond extremely limited threats. It is like owning an extremely expensive revolver, with no sights, no information, and no idea where the enemy is. A complete S-400 battery costs roughly $500 million. When the 92 N6 radar is destroyed, that entire system turns into a military paperweight. The missiles stay in their tubes, the vehicles remain standing. But the real defensive capability simply disappears. And there is an even more brutal detail. Radars like the Nebo-SVU and the 92 N6 cannot be replaced quickly. They require complex manufacturing, sensitive components, and highly trained teams for installation and calibration. This is not something that can be restored in weeks or even in months. By striking these sensors, Ukraine did not just destroy equipment, it broke the Russian decision chain. Without early warning, without engagement radar, and without coordination, the entire defensive bubble over Crimea collapsed functionally. And that leads to the unavoidable consequence. If the radars were blinded, what else was left exposed that night? In theory, none of this should have happened, because between the Ukrainian drones and Belbek's strategic radars stood the last line of defense, the Pantsir S-2. Pantsir is not a long-range system. It is a point defense platform. designed specifically to protect critical assets such as radars, command centers, and larger S-400 batteries. Its role is simple and ruthless: detect short-range threats and destroy them quickly, using a combination of missiles and 30mm automatic cannons. On paper, it is the perfect antidote to drones. In practice, it failed. The first problem was saturation. Pantsir can engage only a limited number of targets at the same time. When multiple drones approach from different vectors, at varying altitudes, and with inconsistent signatures, the system is forced to prioritize. And every act of prioritization creates blind spots. It does not take dozens of drones. It only takes more contacts than an operator can process during critical seconds. The second factor is even more serious: sensor dependence. Pantsir operates using its own radars, but also relies on external data. When larger radars begin to fall or start operating in a degraded state, Pantsir loses context. It reacts late, almost blindly, detecting the target only when it is already too close. There is also the variable of electronic warfare. Modern drones do not arrive clean. They bring interference, false signatures, profile changes, and, in some cases, autonomous navigation that reduces the effectiveness of traditional jamming. This forces the operator to distinguish real threats from noise, a decision that must be made in seconds, in the middle of the night, under pressure. The result is a cruel paradox. The system designed to protect the radars failed to protect even itself. A destroyed pantsir is not just the loss of equipment. It is the collapse of the final layer that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of attack. And when point defense fails, everything behind it becomes a legitimate target. After the explosions, silence followed. From Moscow, there was no press conference, no detailed report, no technical explanation. The Kremlin chose the oldest strategy in the book, to act as if nothing had happened. When pressure began to build, the response was pushed down to local authorities in Crimea. Governors and regional spokespeople spoke of isolated fires, falling debris, and routine air defense activity. There was no mention of destroyed radars, not a single word about the MiG-31, no acknowledgement that the peninsula's main air base had been successfully struck. The problem is that in 2025, narrative cannot compete with imagery. While official statements tried to normalize what happened, photos and videos began circulating on Telegram and other platforms. Columns of smoke visible from kilometers away, charred structures, military equipment reduced to unrecognizable wreckage. Reality escaped control before Moscow even decided which story to tell, and this had an immediate effect on the Russian civilian population living in Crimea. For years, the Kremlin sold the peninsula as a pacified territory, a safe tourist destination, protected by one of the densest air defense networks on the planet. Russian families moved there believing they were far from the war. Resorts, beaches, and peaceful summers were part of the promise. That promise collapsed in a single night. When civilians see drones crossing the sky, explosions near Sevastopol, and supposedly untouchable bases being hit, perception changes. Crimea stops being a rear area, it becomes a front line. And that erodes something that does not show up in military reports: confidence. Moscow's silence did not calm the situation. It did the opposite. It fueled rumors, fear, and a sense of abandonment. When the government does not explain, people assume the worst. And in this case, the worst is simple. If this happened once, it can happen again. The attack on Belbek was not about a radar, a fighter jet, or an airbase. It was about viability. Ukraine made it clear that its objective is not just to cause isolated damage, but to make the occupation of Crimea unsustainable, militarily, economically, and psychologically. Every radar destroyed increases the cost of maintaining troops. Every exposed base demands more systems, more personnel, more money. Every sleepless night for civilians and soldiers erodes the narrative of absolute control. The logic is simple. The more expensive and risky it becomes to occupy Crimea, the less time that occupation can be sustained. Belbek was an anchor, a symbol of air stability, fleet protection, and regional dominance. When it was struck, a door was opened, not only for future attacks, but for a new kind of war. A war of silent attrition, where cheap drones force billion-dollar responses. Nothing suggests this was an isolated event. On the contrary, everything points to a full rehearsal, a live test against the best Russia claimed it had. Now that the vulnerabilities have been exposed, the cost of ignoring them only grows. Crimea remains occupied, but it is no longer safe. And when a territory stops being safe, it stops being strategic. Now the question remains, if even Belbek could be hit, what will be the next target? And how long can Russia still sustain this occupation? Now, Russia claimed that Pokrovsk had fallen. The reality was a perfect trap. Watch the next video and see how a so-called surprise attack turned into total annihilation in just a few minutes, with drones, winter, and intelligence all working against Moscow. And do not forget to subscribe to the Military Ground. I will see you there.